Welcome to the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. We are into our 27th year of organizing programs on topics significant to World War II. And I want to recognize this is the, November is the Harold Deutsch lecture series. And could the family, Elizabeth, could you stand up? And I think a granddaughter's there. Thank you for attending. The seed of the Roundtable was planted in 1986. Harold and I met at the Perkins on 94 and Riverside. If you know where that is, we sat in the atrium, and the decision was made that we were going to do something like we'd experienced at the Army War College. We had just returned from him as a teacher, me as a student. And Harold said, if you can't organize it and get enough speakers, I'll teach my World War II history course, which would have been a great thing. And I don't know if many of you know this, but he had that lecture series of his course, World War II history course, on videotape at the University of Minnesota. As we have tried to retrieve that, we found out it has been destroyed. So you might want to talk to some of your influential people on the faculty and regents at the University of Minnesota, but nothing can be done with it at this point. But the thing that we are trying to do is to bring out topics that Harold had an interest in. Early, we had a lot of the conspiracy speakers come in. One of the things that Harold told me in his later years, he wished he had known more about Ultra and the revelations as they would have influenced decisions. After he died, we had a gentleman by the name of Don Bussey, who had been an Ultra officer for the 7th Army, and we have that on tape and DVD and with Rob. A couple of years ago, we had a gentleman by the name of Colin Burke come in. Colin is actually who connected us with our speaker this evening, and he's written extensively on the use of computers and the intercept. And Minnesota, if you don't know, had a great part to play in that. A group called Northwest Aeronautics that built gliders, and Minnesota was the second largest manufacturer of gliders in World War II. When the glider contract ended, they then took that management team and organized something called ERA, Engineering Research Associates. If you look at the family tree of that, it blossomed, and there's a gentleman by the name of Don Hall who is doing a new book that's going to be embellishing that a little bit, but the Mesa book that Axel mentioned talks about that also. Not only did the contract from National Cash Register, NCR, in Dayton, Ohio, moved to Minnesota and was renamed ERA, but as entrepreneurs and free spirits within that new emerging industry evolved, Bill Norris was one of those people, and of course, you know, he ended up doing control data. But in talking to some of the people on that early computer genesis in Minnesota, a lot of those people spun off into what we now know as the medical industry of Minnesota. The book in Tom Meese's book actually shows between the medical device industry we have and what started out at the kind of the peak of the IBM control data UNIVAC, almost the same number of people employed in related fields. So this is an important topic. It has relevance to our industry and our commerce in Minnesota. Our speaker this evening is David Kahn, who wrote the books that Axel had mentioned. He got his degree, his bachelor's degree from Bucknell, and he didn't know what Minnesota was, so I've been trying to snow him without snow. He later got his PhD at Oxford. He spent his career in the newspaper industry. He was with the Herald Tribune in Paris for a number of years. The first book that was mentioned, Codebreakers, was published in 1967, and it was updated in 1994 after the Winterbottom divulging of the Ultra Code. He also wrote a book that we also, 1978, was Hitler's Spies, and he did another book called Seizing Enigma in 1991, and I know that he's got some new books ongoing right now. So, but give him a warm Midwest, Minnesota welcome. David, welcome, sir.
And yeah, so while I was trying to do this book on American intelligence in World War II, I needed to figure out who were the greatest spies who gave information to the United States and to the Allies. And I thought, first of all, of Richard Sorge. Richard Sorge was a German who was a communist, and he was working as a newspaper correspondent in Japan. And he was providing information not so much to the Germans, but particularly under the table to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union needed to know, particularly after Germany had invaded, what was going to happen. Were the Japanese going to strike them from the rear and make Stalin find a two-front war, or what was going on? Anyhow, Sorge managed to find out that the Japanese were not intending to do this. He reported this, and although he was captured later on, he managed to provide the information to the Soviet Union that they didn't have to worry about a two-front war. So was Sorge the greatest spy of World War II? Well, maybe. But I went on and continued to look at some additional possibilities. There was a man named Garbo. That was his code name. Garbo was a Spaniard who was pro-English, and he managed to sell the Germans, who were concerned, of course, about Spain, what was going to happen there, and what may have been going on in the Atlantic Theater. So he offered to sell information to the Germans because he was going over to the United Kingdom to find information and get information and work for them as a businessman. And while he was over there, he was going to provide information. The Germans bought this, but Garbo was actually a double agent. He was never a German agent, and he was always in favor of Great Britain. And he fed information to the Germans during particularly the invasion of Normandy, in which he told them that the attack was only a feint, not the real one. The main attack was going to come later on, a little further north. The Germans believed this. They held back 4 divisions. The Allies maintained their lodgment in Germany, in France in June of 1944, maintained their lodgment and went on to go over to Germany and win that war. So was he one of the greatest? Well, maybe, maybe not. Then there were 2 other people, a man named Colby and another man named Josevius. They were working for Allen Dulles, who was head of the OSS. These men provided information to him about what was going on in Germany and the V2 weapons and all of that. But none of this really mattered. It turned out that the most important man who was providing very important information was a different man. And before I give you his name, which will be the subject of this whole thing, I'll tell you how I came about to learn about it. In 1993, I was in Oxford. I was doing some work for my dissertation under Hugh Trevor Roper, who was probably the most famous historian in the world at the time. And Hugh Trevor Roper's job during World War II had been to provide information on what the Allies knew about German intelligence. That's why they gave me to him to get information on what was doing and to write my dissertation. Anyhow, while I was over in Oxford in 1993, I got a call from a friend who was a former ambassador of the United States who during World War I had been breaking codes for the Allied expedition, or the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. And he had helped me a great deal with information when I was doing my book, The Codebreakers. He was a great help. Now he had retired, and I was over in Oxford. He was coming on over to visit. He called me up and said, "David, join us for lunch with some other people." So I came on down. These were other former British ambassadors and diplomatic people. And during the conversation at lunchtime, the conversation turned to a man who had written a book called Enigma. This is a French person, and this book revealed for the first time that the French had obtained information from a turncoat about information about the Enigma. So with this information, which the British got through this man, they were able to use this information to help them solve the Enigma, which they hadn't been able to do on their own. Anyhow, when this came into to Great Britain, the man who wrote this book, Bertrand, had never mentioned the man's name. He had told this story about how important this man was, which is absolutely true, but he never mentioned the name of the actual turncoat who had provided this information to the French, and then who the French gave it then to the Poles, with whom they had a post-World War I treaty of alliance against Germany, which they feared that Germany might well begin to attempt to revanche and start a new war, which, as you know, eventually did happen. Anyhow, he provided this information to this man, but he never mentioned the man's name. So when I heard about this and when I read this book, I decided I would try to talk to this man, Captain Bertrand, to find out who the name of this man was, the actual spy who had provided this information to the French in 1931. Because Bertrand was a French intelligence officer who had handled this man. When the spy came to the French, he appeared first in the French embassy, and he was passed over to this man, and then Bertrand handled him. And Bertrand was the man who spoke with him in various hotels in Brussels and in other parts in Germany and elsewhere. So he knew who the man was because he had dealt with him 15 or 18 times throughout the war in pre-World War I period, pre-World War II period. I wanted to talk to Bertrand. Bertrand was at the time retired. He was the mayor of a little town, Théoul-sur-Mer, on the Mediterranean coast in the southern part of France. And sure, he was very happy to talk to me. So I went on over to talk to him, and I did talk to him. He was very friendly. He was very nice. Well, the main thing I wanted to find out was the name of this guy. He wouldn't tell me that. He said the man's family is still alive, and we don't want to embarrass him and all of that. Not only that, his brother was a famous Panzer general. He's still alive. I don't want to reveal his name. Okay, that was that. I did that. So while talking to this man, he said that the spy had worked for an organization in Nazi Germany called the Forschungsamt. The Forschungsamt was Hermann Goering's personal intelligence eavesdropping agency. And the man who had worked for this office was a man whom I had spoken to when doing my first book, Hitler's Spies. I was still working on that book. And I got to him and called him up. We had had a number of interviews, and he was very helpful and very nice to me, and we got along very well, even though he was a Nazi and I'm a Jew. Nevertheless, we managed to do things quite well. He's a friendly guy. And I got very good information from him about the Nazi period and about the Forschungsamt, which nobody had really not learned about because the Forschungsamt documents had been destroyed during the war. There was very few documentary evidence left in Nazi Germany about that time. So I called this man up when Bertrand refused to say who the spy was because he had mentioned somewhere along the way that the spy had worked for the Forschungsamt. So I called up this man over in Germany and said, Seifert, and said, who was this man who had revealed information? He gave me the name first of a man named Plas. Then he said, no, Plas wasn't the guy because Plas had never worked in the 1920s in the Chiffrierstelle, which was the German Army code-breaking and code-making agency. Who was it? He said, oh, there was another guy named Hans-Thilo Schmidt. Hans-Thilo Schmidt. I had never heard the name. Nobody had ever heard the name. But anyhow, I went on back to Bertrand during my interview, and I said, listen, was it Hans-Thilo Schmidt? He wouldn't say. He said, listen, I'm not going to tell you because the man's name is secret, and I don't want to embarrass his family any longer. Okay, that was the end of that at the time being. But then a book came out called The Ultraseek. This book was the first revelation about code breaking, which came out in 1976, I think it was. And I was asked to review that book for the New York Times. And reviewing that book for the Times, I had occasion finally to mention that man's name, Hans-Thilo Schmidt, which I did. So I wrote that and published it in the Times. I think that was the first time that man's name had ever been revealed. And when that review came out, I sent a copy over to Bertrand. Not to be nasty, but I thought he might be interested. Back came a furious letter from Bertrand saying, you guys have revealed this secret, which I had kept for all of these years. Well, that, of course, was confirmation that that was the right name. Anyhow, so I used that and mentioned that somewhere along the way, and then wrote some books, wrote books about it. And Winterbottom's book came out and was published, and other books revealed a great deal about the about code breaking and how this material had helped. Then, when it appeared that Winterbottom's book was going to be published, and it was shortly before it was published that I heard about this, I interviewed a man who was a young man who had come to me in Oxford because I was writing about codes and I was writing about intelligence, and I was asked by the head of the history faculty to please help this man, if I could, with his work on intelligence in the Napoleonic Wars. Well, I didn't know anything about intelligence in the Napoleonic Wars, but intelligence has certain characteristics which are similar all around, so I offered to help him. This man was a young Pole, and in talking to him, he said to me, listen, my dad was in Polish intelligence during World War II, and he has some material about codes. And he has an entire document about them. So sure enough, I went with him to their home in a suburb of Oxford, South Hanksey. And this man, who had been in intelligence, in Polish intelligence of the war, produced an entire manuscript of 30-odd pages in Polish. I couldn't understand one word of it. And in mathematics, heavily mathematics. Couldn't understand a word of it. Nevertheless, this document, he said to me, was the work of the man who was the chief breaker of the Enigma machine. And he said, with the material that had been provided by the Pole who had given information to the French, with this the Poles were able to make the final breakthrough, which they hadn't been able to do because the mathematics was too complicated and the code system was too difficult. They were able to make the solution and break through and break the Enigma machine, which they were able to do and read Polish messages. Well, as we all know, it didn't help very much during the Polish campaign. But after that was over, the French took the Poles under their wing, and they went to the south of France and continued to solve German messages using these new techniques until France was overrun. Then the Poles went to Great Britain, where they helped Great Britain complete the solution of the Enigma machine, which they were able to successfully do, which enabled them to basically win the Battle of the Atlantic and go on used to solve these messages during the rest of the land campaign. So basically, that was the story. And subsequently, I found out the name of the spy, Hans-Thilo Schmidt. I discovered that the Germans discovered him during the war and shot him as a spy. He died without leaving any papers or anything like that. And when I say that Hans-Thilo Schmidt was probably the greatest spy of World War II, that's what I mean. So in brief, that's basically the story of Hans-Thilo Schmidt. And then all of the rest of the story of the Enigma continued to flow from that. Because with this material, the British were able to create those bombs in the great code-breaking area at Bletchley Park and continued to go on and help win the war. People always say to me, hey, Dave, if you know that, did that mean that code-breaking won the war? No. Code-breaking helped win the war. World War II was won by the guys in the trenches, the guys who were shooting, the guys who were fired at, and the guys who were laid down their lives for American and European freedom. So that's what's going on. Thank you very much.
In your book, Codebreakers, the first chapter is about Pearl Harbor. Why do you start the book about Pearl Harbor, and then the second chapter is about 3000 BC?
I used to be a newspaper reporter. A newspaper reporter always gives the basic facts in the first paragraphs. And I think that people were very interested. This came out in 56 or something like that, 67. And that was a burning question in American history. How could Pearl Harbor occur? So I looked into it, and they said, people said, we were breaking the codes. How come we couldn't read that? Well, the Japanese were not stupid. They never sent a single message saying that we're going to attack Pearl Harbor. So it was not possible for the Americans to read them. That's why it'll be very interesting to hear what Mr. Morrison has. Is it Morrison? Who is Kimmel? Mr. Kimmel, who's going to be saying tomorrow, next month when he comes here to hear what he has to say about that whole thing.
Of course, I'll also make the point on the Tom Misa book. Coincidentally, the first chapter in Tom Misa's book is about the attack on Pearl Harbor.
What's Tom Misa? What's the title of the book?
The Misa, it's called Digital State. It's about the history of Minnesota. So it's he must have taken a lesson from you and going to the middle to start at the beginning. So.
Okay.
You were talking about some of the ways of authenticating the messages. There was a story about a Nazi transmission station that transmitted nothing. Nothing today. Can you tell that story?
Yeah. One way of breaking the Enigma was to guess the plain text, the original text of a message, and line that up with the intercept in coded form, and then try to find the arrangement of rotor wheels, and I'll explain about those in 1 second, of the rotor wheels which would produce from that guessed plain text the cryptogram. And if you knew that, then you had the key to read those messages, and not only that message, which of course you knew because you had guessed the plain text, but also other messages sent in that same key. So that was the way that the arrangement of keys was discovered. And the way it worked was this. There was a station, a German station in Norway, in Stavanger, which is, I think, off the coast of Norway. And this message, day after day, this unit, day after day, I'm sorry. Yeah. Day after day would send a 15-letter message in German, nicht zu melden, nothing to report. Well, if you get this day after day and another 15 message, you can guess. Maybe the 16th is going to say nicht zu melden. So you have the original plain text, you have the intercepted ciphertext, and then you can work one against the other to figure out the rotor wheels, the original keying system of that message. And when you have that key for that day, you can read not only that message, which you already know, but you can read other messages sent in that key. So you can read Admiral Polar Coast of the German Navy, or the Admiral Southern Coast of Norway, and all of those, and read those messages, and not only read those messages, but other messages which were sent in the German naval key for that day. So you were able to read that. That's one way in which the British were able to solve this. And it happened very frequently. It didn't happen every day, but very frequently it did happen. They were able to solve many messages going on to help win the war, as I explained earlier.
But the Army and the Navy had separate Enigma codes, correct?
Yes, and the Air Force.
Can you explain that?
Well, I'm not sure how I can explain it. What do you mean?
Didn't one had a different number of rotors?
Yeah. All right, let me explain to how the Enigma worked. You've all heard about the Enigma machine. Let me explain what it is. Imagine a hockey puck, just a piece of Bakelite or hard rubber. On one side, 26 electrical contacts. On the other side, 26 electrical contacts connected irregularly at random through the center of this so-called hockey puck. You would send an electrical contact, electrical spark, through one point. It comes in at A, it comes out at X. That's already an encipherment. But that's not a very difficult kind of cipher, because you can solve those in a few minutes. Now the rotor turns one click when you're going to encipher the next letter. You're shooting in the electrical impulse at the top again. This time the letter B is there. And when you're signing in, you're enciphering it, it comes in at A, comes in at B, and this time it comes out at Q or something like that. And as this wheel turns, different letters are coming into play, and different letters are ciphered. So that if you have a message A, it'll come at Q, B, Z, D, whatever the internal wiring is. And with that, that's how the Enigma worked. But if you are able to guess the original message, either by guessing it or by solving another message which will give it to you, you can then reconstruct the internal wiring of that, and then go on to read those messages, and not only those messages, but other messages sent using the same system.
But the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force had different numbers of rotors, correct?
It's a little more complicated than that.
Okay.
Yes, they did have different numbers of rotors. The Navy was the best and set up the rotors in a particular way. The Army and the Air Force, which were sloppy in their work, had a way of, these rotors were set into the machine, and the encipher was to choose those letters as the starting position and then transmit them in a certain way to the recipient. So when those messages were set up, often the people who were enciphering messages would use girlfriends' names or dirty words or stuff like that as the starting position. So these were easy to guess, and you were able to guess those. And once you had those starting position, then you were able to read those messages and carry on and solve those messages. And then if a new day came along, you would find it again. Sometimes you wouldn't do it, and sometimes you did. And those messages were solved that way.
How many, could you raise your hand, how many people have been to Bletchley Park? I know that someone on our tour 2 years ago, I couldn't get him here this evening, but as a part of connecting with this program, I found that there's a gentleman now that lives in Stillwater who worked in Ultra. We're planning to have him on our May program because he briefed General Bradley on some of the Ultra intercepts. But Bletchley Park is something very worthwhile going to One of the people that was very important there was Alan Turing. Can you explain how Turing at Bletchley Park was really the giant in that code-breaking operation?
Alan Turing was a brilliant mathematician. He got his PhD, he's English, but he got a PhD at Princeton in I think, an outgrowth of that work was a fundamental theorem in mathematics based on his article called Uncomputable Numbers. And he proved that anything that, that could be operated as a so-called Turing machine, which could produce any kind of numbers or discover anything, was able to be solved and constructed in mathematical formulas. So he was a terrific guy, and the way he managed to solve the enigma and produce the machine was to develop a device that, one, when given the alleged plaintext as nicht zu melden, was able to set up the created series of rotors in a row and what their starting position was, and then read not only the message, that message, but other messages that day, and then go on to read other messages. And that was the way the British were able to work this successful code-breaking agency at Bletchley Park.
How long did it take to typically to break a code?
If they had a lot of rotor sequences to run through, it could take 48 hours. Sometimes it could be shorter, and they could do it in 24 hours, and sometimes they'd get it more quickly. But the length of solution varied very much. But usually it was about 48 hours was the typical time to solve those messages.
Oftentimes, as I've watched documentaries, they have made the point that we were getting the message or the text of the message before the Germans could decipher it. Is that true?
Maybe once or twice. I think that's one of those stories that people love to tell. May have happened once or twice, but usually not often.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm going to come out in the audience. I'm going to go up an aisle here, and then I'll go over there. Any questions?
Sir, could you comment on the quality, if you will, of German intelligence, the particular the spying? I heard from the history that I've read that they were not particularly good as spies.
They were lousy at spies. First of all, if you were over in England, you had spies over in England, what are they going to do? They're all going to be caught quickly by the British, which they do. What about their service and their intelligence in general? That too was not very good, except on the lower levels, they were very good. But on the higher levels, they didn't have the higher level code breaking that the Allies had. And so when you have code breaking intelligence, you're looking right into the heart of the enemy's statements and plans and all of that. They never got that. They never solved our top messages, which we were able to do. So their intelligence was good at the low levels, not good at the top levels. And then look at it this way. Suppose you gave information that Hitler didn't want to hear. That happened a lot. He turned away with it, ignored it, and passed it back saying, I'm not going to bother with this. There was one case, a man told me, a former Luftwaffe officer, he had found information that the Russians had lined up enormous quantities of artillery and ready and other forces about to attack. And how can you deny these aerial photographs? Hitler managed to do it. He said, I don't believe this. It's not true. We can't do this. The Russians can't do it either, therefore. And so as a consequence, they were surprised and lost that battle as well.
Mr. Kahn, could you explain to the group, as far as the transmission, was it through radio frequency, or what technology were they able to, from the Enigma machine out to like submarines, or how was that transmitted?
By radio.
By radio?
Yes,
by
so
radio
that's why the British were able to intercept it and read those messages.
Something you commented on, and we brought it up in an earlier meeting, The one thing that the British did smartly was to take any high-ranking German and they put them in a compound in England and they planted these microphones all around. The Americans didn't do that.
Yes, we did.
We did. I've always heard that was a criticism of the way we dealt with that.
No.
Where did we get the where did the Americans have?
When we captured Germans, we put them into in a camp somewhere outside of Washington. I can't remember right now where it is. And we had these places bugged, so that when the Germans were talking to each other, we'd pick up this information. Didn't always work or provide valuable information, but we did do that. And the British, of course, did that with much higher ranking officers, because the higher level Germans were held in Trent House, I think it was, in somewhere outside of London. And when they were intercepted and bugged, they provided information. I don't think it was very tactical information, but it provided information about supplies and problems and the way Hitler was running the war. So it was more general, more superficial, and general kind of information which they obtained. And those intercepts have been published.
After the war, what happened to the Polish mathematicians who worked on this and provided this information? Did they go on to careers in engineering? What?
They were screwed. No, the British, although they had gotten information from the Poles, treated them as second-class citizens. And they were kept on in Bletchley Park solving low-level material. And then later, after the war, they were sent back to Poland, and the man who was the key cryptanalyst in that group, Rejewski, went back to an ordinary job, and then subsequently, when the story came out, then he was interviewed by people, wrote memoirs and all of that, and he's finally, toward the end of his life, he's deceased now, obtained the recognition that he really deserved, because he was the guy who really solved the Enigma machine.
David, the question I asked you actually at lunch today, why did Churchill order for all of the Bletchley Park equipment to be destroyed, and why wasn't it mentioned in any of his History of World War II memoirs?
The answer to your first question is I don't know. Nobody seems to know why those code-breaking machines were destroyed after the war. There was no need to keep them up, but why none were preserved, I don't know. And your other question was, why
didn't Churchill mention any of his writings?
After World War II, decolonization began, and countries like India became independent, Ghana, Nigeria, all of those. These countries needed cipher machines. Where were they going to go? They went to the mother country to say, give us some cipher machines. And so they had captured many, the British had captured many Enigma machines, and they said, listen, this is a pretty good machine, you can use this. Now, of course, the Indians and the Nigerians are not so stupid as to think that if Britain was giving this, they couldn't read this. Nevertheless, the British gave them this machine, but the Indians were not concerned so much about the British. The Indians were concerned about the Pakistanis, and Nigeria about Ghana and all of that. So those countries did not have and could not buy the ability to read this, and it protected their messages in the ways that they needed. So when this was going on and Churchill was writing his memoirs, the Allies didn't want that story to come out. And there were a number of articles or documents in the American National Archives, I suppose in the British ones as well, in which they say, listen, we don't want this stuff to come out. The war is over. We may be confronting the Russians, so we don't want anybody to know about this. And it was kept secret until finally Group Captain Winterbottom, who had a very insignificant role during the war, and all he did was distribute the information out. He had nothing to do with the code breaking. When he was finally allowed to present this information, I've never understood why he was able to do it, even though I tried to find out. Then finally, Group Captain Winterbottom, who was really a very insignificant guy, and played no real role in the key job of breaking the codes, was allowed to produce as he made a lot of money with his book, The Ultra Secret, and the people who had kept that secret for many years didn't gain any financial rewards from it, and only now is that story really coming out and people telling their stories more and more.
My question relates to the polls. In the stories that you have seen in the movies, it's like they captured one of the machines and then the Brits got the machines, but it sounds more like it was theoretical. There was an algorithm that was written, and this page of algorithms was what solved it. I guess it's pretty remarkable that a mathematician was able just to see that and write it down and pass it on. And was that the case? It's just a page of algorithms that solved or provided the great deal of the information.
The situation was as follows. When the Germans began putting in the Enigma into use, first in the Navy, then in the Army in the 1920s, the Poles were, of course, very concerned about Germany. Hitler soon came to power, and he was raging against Poland because, first of all, they were subhumans. Second of all, they had, in the reconstituted Poland, they had territory which had been held by Germany since Frederick the Great. And so the Poles were very naturally concerned about this. There's a story that an Enigma machine was captured by the Poles in one of the customs areas and were able to copy it. I don't believe that story. I think the Poles solved it purely analytically, doing mathematical work, and solved this with mistakes that the Germans made in transmissions, utilized these transmissions, and they were smarter than the Germans, which the Germans don't like to believe. But they were smarter than the Germans, and they were able to solve it that way. So the other story that you mentioned about capturing a cipher machine or one that was left in custody of the customs, I don't really believe. I think it was purely analytical work.
My understanding of the situation was back in the early days of NRC or NCR, and that the core group in NCR had formerly been with the Office of Naval Research, and they were the real brains behind the scientific computers as they grew after the place became UNIVAC.
I'm not an expert on the history of computers, but Howard Engstrom, who was a naval codebreaker in World War II, became one of the heads of ERA. And so that expertise and ability carried over to the beginning of the work with computers. And the early computers were based in part on work done for codebreaking during World War II.
But by the book, by the Misa book. Maybe that'll explain it to you.
When we went through Bletchley Park, we were paraded through a room, and the machine there was functioning. It was made totally from parts. And then we went a little distance away. There was another machine there that dealt apparently with upper-level military command and diplomatic things. And then down in the basement was the bomb. Now, can you help a little on, it seems there's a number of different machines involved here in this process.
Yes. The Germans didn't use one single code system any more than we did, anybody did. Low-level codes are not going to be enciphered in high-level machines where they can be captured on the front lines. So the Germans had several machines. Toward the end of the war, they had a new, more complicated machine called the Geheimschreiber. And this was done under a different system than the Enigma. For solving this, the British developed a kind of proto-computer. It was called Colossus. And that was one of the machines that was operating there. They reproduced that Colossus. They solved that. The Enigma machines were still being solved using the so-called bombs. So those may have been the machines that you saw during your visit to Bletchley Park.
We talked this afternoon at lunch about where does Bletchley Park fit into the to British history and the history, Britain's history in World War II. And you mentioned a guy named, you couldn't remember his name, George Steiner, and he said that Bletchley Park is the single greatest achievement of Britain during 1939 to 1945.
During the 20th century, he
during
even
the
said.
20th century. Would you, would you agree with that statement and explain this a little bit in depth?
Yes. George Steiner is a writer and historian. He lives in Cambridge. He's, I think, of German descent. He's English now. And he wrote a review of the Enigma books. At the end of this review, he says that Bletchley Park may be the greatest achievement of Britain in the 20th century. And I tend to agree with that, because it was really a remarkable achievement. And they were able, with this, to bring Britain and the West into the computer age, and of course, more importantly and earlier on, solve Enigma messages, which helped win World War II. People say Codebreaking won World War II. That's not the case. World War II was won by, to simplify, by American production and Russian manpower. That's how the war was won. The codebreaking helped it, but it was those two things that really helped us win the war, I believe. Somebody else may have different views, but that's my conclusion.
Yes, Dave. I was in the cryptologic community when your book first came out, and it was a bombshell. And I'm wondering, how much cooperation did you get from British and American intelligence in writing that book?
None.
I'm amazed.
None.
You had such detailed information in there.
Some people, I did talk to some people who knew about current material. And listen, if you work hard and you do your work and you do your homework and you dig around, you can find out an awful lot of material which people think isn't available. But it is available. And if you're just a good reporter and do your work on that, you can find that out very much. No, there was a statement by the part of the the American National Security Agency guy when this book was coming out, and they realized that this might reveal material. Their feeling is, and it's not irrational, that any mention of codes or code breaking will make people think about their own codes. Maybe we should tighten our codes. Maybe we should try to crack American codes. It's not a thing they want to have out. This whole more recent stories, these numerous stories about NSA, is making NSA very unhappy, because people are going to be more careful about their conversations, more careful about their encryption and all of that. So they didn't want the book to come out, but nevertheless it came out. Now, if I may say, many years later, they realized that the book was a terrific thing for them, because it turned many people onto code breaking and made many people interested in codes and increased their recruitment a great deal and enabled more people to join NSA, improving the quality of their work and the number of people who were working there. So it turned out to be a good thing in the end, even though they thought it would be bad. Yes, sir.
I just wanted you to comment about the impact that Yardley's book, The Black Chamber, had on the Japanese code-making efforts before World War II.
Herbert Yardley was an American who set up the first code-breaking agency during World War I and then kept it up during the 1920s. Then when Henry Stimson, who was then Secretary of State, said, listen, Americans don't read other people's mail, and closed it down. Then Yardley, who was broke, wrote a book, The American Black Chamber, and if you guys haven't read that book, that is a fascinating book, even today. Herbert Yardley was a fabulous writer. I wish I could write as well as he did. Anyhow, he wrote his book, and many people said that when the publication of this book came out in 1931, everybody was going to improve their codes, change their codes, make it impossible for Americans to read. Well, it turns out that's not the case. I used some documents from the British Code-Breaking Agency and from the German Code-Breaking Agency in the 1930s, and it turns out that despite Yardley's revelations, there was not only no diminution in the number of messages that was solved, but they actually increased. In partly because more traffic had to be done. So Yardley's book, which had many people thought to be a negative effect, didn't have a negative effect. And subsequently, one of the main American codebreakers, a man who was the chief solver of the Purple Machine, said, listen, Yardley's book, everybody said was a bad thing. It turns out to have been a great thing because it enabled the United States to have more time to solve the more difficult systems that the Japanese put into effect after Yardley's book came in. And they had 10 years from 1931, when Yardley's book came out, to 1941, when Pearl Harbor occurred, to solve these much more difficult systems. And this man says that when Yardley did this, he's always vilified for this, but I can stand up and shout it was a terrific thing that he did. So it's always a little more nuanced than people tend to think.
I have two questions. One is, how often did the Germans change their key? And number two, even though the code breaking did not win the war, it certainly had an effect on the war. Perhaps it shortened the war. Could you talk about some of the most important operational advantages that it gave to the Allies?
It's not possible to quantify that. But it certainly helped a great deal when you're able to read what the enemy is planning to do. How you're going to quantify that, I don't know. But Eisenhower, after the war, said in a letter to the head of the British Codebreaking Agency and the British whole intelligence organization, said, York has been of priceless value to me. And it did certainly save an awful lot of American lives, and American British lives, and Russian lives as well. So it was very useful, but I don't know how you quantify that, and I wouldn't attempt to do so either. You had one other question, I think.
How did the Germans change the key?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a much more complicated question, because when you had the Enigma, those keys were changed every 8 hours on the Enigma. How often the wheels were changed? Much less frequently. In point of fact, the central wiring of the wheels was never changed during the war. So it happened that when some messages were intercepted, they couldn't be solved at the time. Sometimes they were only solved weeks later. So you could read the messages, but that didn't have much of an effect on the war. So it's a much more complicated question and a much more complicated answer as to how maybe the solutions affected the war.
Yeah, the focus tonight has been on breaking the German code. The focus tonight has been on the German code breaking. We also broke the Japanese code. Can you compare the complexity of the two, or the effort? You know, how complex was it, and what kind of effort had gone into that breaking of the Japanese code?
The Japanese used paper codes. The Germans used mechanical devices. The Japanese were not stupid. They had good systems, but the Americans were able to read these. And with the solution of these codes, we were able, for example, to read where Japanese transports were sailing, and we could have our submarines lie in wait for these convoys and sink the ships. So it was of very great importance, not only for sinking Japanese troop ships, but for sinking Japanese freighters and basically starving out Japan. Toward the end of the war, they weren't having enough food, they didn't have enough raw materials, they were in very bad shape, in very large part of our solution of Japanese messages, which were able to tell us where the troop ships and the convoys were coming and to sink them and help starve out the Japanese mainlands and main islands. Does that answer the question?
I just recently saw something on TV on Mike Rowe and...
I'm sorry, what?
Okay. I just recently saw something on TV by Mike Rowe on alcohol, and he talked about bootleggers and how the Bureau of Alcohol was able to break the bootleggers code and applied that to World War II. And specifically, he mentioned two people, a husband and wife. Could you comment on them?
Yes. The husband and wife team was William Friedman, who was an Army guy, and his wife, Elizabeth Friedman, who was working for the Navy and or the Coast Guard. They were very similar, or the Treasury Department. And during the 1920s, the rumrunners were bringing their supplies illegally into the United States, coordinating their movements by radio. The British, the Treasury, and this woman, Elizabeth Friedman, was able to read these messages. I don't think they stopped many of the transports of alcohol coming in. But afterwards, when they were able to capture these people and use this information in prosecutions, many of them were captured and many of them were found guilty and prosecuted as well. So the work is true. And then the story is true that she did a great deal of work during Prohibition. Then after Prohibition, during World War II, she continued to solve messages of the Japanese Navy and I think also of, not of the Army. Colonel Friedman, her husband, was able to solve many messages, and was also instrumental in leading the team that solved the Japanese purple machine, which enabled us to solve many diplomatic messages. Does that answer the question?
And just by coincidence, the Minnesota Historical Society just opened up a new exhibit on Prohibition. So do a little cross.
Yeah.
Okay. This is on. Okay. I have two quick questions. One is, can you describe the systems that the U.S. used? I've read that they had a mechanical machine comparable to Enigma, and you mentioned that that wasn't cracked ever by the Germans. How about by the Japanese? And then secondly, kind of a post-World War II question, to what extent was the early cracking of the Russian codes instrumental in the prosecution of the Rosenbergs and all of that type of activity?
As far as the first question goes with the American machine, the American machine was called Sagaba. It was based on the rotor system. I explained the rotors. With a wired code wheel. But it was used in a much better system, in a much better way. The German Enigma turned over like an odometer in a car. This was controlled by a separate set of wheels, which made the rotor wheels turn in irregular fashion. The rotor messages on the part of the United States were never solved by Germany. They attempted to solve it. They saw right away that they couldn't solve it, and they reverted from high-level stuff to lower-level material and solved that. So the short answer is that the American rotor system was never solved by the Germans, and our system was far superior. And what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Let me trigger David.
Sure.
David, was that machine that the Americans made, was that the one that was built by NCR in Dayton?
It may have been built by them. I think so. I don't think it was invented by them. But it was constructed by them.
Based on the British model, correct?
No, based on an American model by Colonel Friedman and some of the people who worked for him. It was a separate machine. Oh, the Rosenbergs, yes.
Oh, the Rosenbergs, yeah.
Right. Short answer is I don't know much about it. The longer answer is a few years ago, it was released that the United States was reading Soviet messages during World War II when they were an ally. I'm sure they were reading ours as well, because we had very poor systems at the time. We're reading these messages. Subsequently, in the 1950s or 60s, these messages were declassified. They were codenamed Venona. It's a word, doesn't mean anything. It's a made-up word. And some of these messages may have been used in that trial, the Rosenberg trial. But I don't think there has been much detail about it, and frankly, I don't know about it. And I don't think that many of the intercepts were used in the Rosenberg trial, because that came about before the release of these messages, so it was still secret at that time. And apparently it wasn't necessary in any event to reveal that information for the conviction to take place.
Could you elaborate on the Japanese paper system that you spoke of earlier?
Sure, it's a very simple system. It's like, imagine an English-French dictionary. You write in English, you translate into French. Well, if you're not a French speaker, you can't understand it. It works the same way with the Japanese codes. Japanese on one side, they turned it not into French, but into code numbers. So for the word attack at dawn might be 3964 or something like that. The Americans were able to solve those messages and read then where the Japanese convoys were coming, have our submarines lay in wait for them, and sink those ships when they were there. Is that clear how it works? It's like a two-part foreign language dictionary.
Can you go into maybe how much we relied on the so-called scrambler telephone system, which the Germans were able to break relatively easily?
Early in war, if you send a message by radio, anybody can intercept it. No question about that. To prevent that, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company in the 1920s devised scramblers. They used it first off Catalina Island to transmit messages from Catalina Island by radio telephone to Los Angeles, and then on the landline, which wasn't so easy to intercept. So these messages were used, a rather simple system, an inverter, so that the high-level tones sounded low-level and all of that. So this was a rather simple system, and it was in use at the early part of the war. When this was in use, the Germans were able to intercept these messages and were able to solve them. Later on in the war, the Americans, realizing how weak the system was, invented a much more complicated system, put that into use, and from that time on, the Germans and anybody else who wanted to intercept were not able to, well, they were intercepted, but couldn't understand what the messages said. So that began around 1943, and from that time on, our messages were secret, and the system was called Sig Sally. Sig for signal, Sally was just a made-up word somewhere along the way. Is that clear?
Yeah. My question is, who developed the Enigma system for the Germans? And apparently, by just the dates you've used, this was in use for almost 20 years before the beginning of World War II. Wouldn't that indicate, or wouldn't that tell a rational German that a system that had been around that long was highly susceptible to being broken?
No. And I'll tell you, no. And they were not stupid, but there was a reason for that. First of all, the rotor system, and I explained how it was, two wheels, a wheel with that was a system that was divided independently in Sweden, in the United States, and in Germany, all around the end of World War II. These people were motivated by the hope of getting rich. When the war was over, international trade was opening up, and there would be international trade, and you'd need to send messages back and forth and keep them secret. So this system was devised to use that. But it never took off. Commerce wasn't that important, and secrecy was sufficient with the codes, the paper codes that they used at that time. So they enshrouded the messages not only in that basic system, but put in other complications to make it impossible for other people to read those messages. Even if you had the machine, there would be so many possibilities for setting it up that you couldn't solve it in a reasonable time. So they were not stupid, but they were not able to devise a system which wasn't able to be protected against interception with the how can I put it, the electronic devices which the Alan Turings of the world were able to solve.
Many submarine skippers in the Pacific were aware that their intercepts were magic derived, but how many
were they?
Well,
I don't know about that.
Well,
I don't think they were told that.
Well, according to Gene Flucky, he knew it was magic derived. So
he knew, but I don't think the skippers of the submarines knew.
He was the skipper of the submarine, the Barb. In any case,
Okay, I'm sorry.
How many people in the world knew of the existence of magic and were able to take action on it? How many high-level people?
A couple of dozen, I would say. And the great problem of the Navy during this time was, should they give this information to the enemy, which was the U.S. Army? So, and it mattered because the Japanese Army, like the American Army, sails its own troop ships. So you don't solve, if you want to find out what's happening with a troop ship, you're not going to solve a U.S. Navy message, you're going to solve a U.S. Army message. It was the same with the Japanese. You had to solve the Japanese Army. So it was the U.S. Army which was solving Japanese Army messages. And then as the problem arose, should they give this to the enemy, Navy, the U.S. Navy? And they finally decided, yes, we're fighting the same war. They did give it to the Navy. And with great success, because many transports were sunk and many supply ships were sunk. And near the end of the war, Japan was starving and unable to do very much with its war effort and with even to feed its own people.
David, among the leadership of the Allies in World War II, who were the best consumers of Ultra?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know. It was very high level, restricted to very high level people. And if you were, say, a commander of the Third Army, Patton, you would get that information through a special circuit, would go to the ultra officer, who would then take Patton out into a field and tell him, this is what we're getting. So it was very highly controlled, and not very many people knew about it.
Well, I'm trying to recall 20-some-odd years ago when we had Don Bussey. He was the ultra officer for the 7th Army, General Patch. And he was the only one that had the information. He had a couple of radio people that would bring in the transmissions and someone that would decrypt it. But can you explain how that would work out? The message comes in, it's decoded. Who knows that, and how is it transmitted to the ultra officer that's then given to the commander?
The way I understand it was this. Message is intercepted. It's attempted to be solved. It's solved by the people in Bletchley, or if it was Navy stuff, some guys here in Washington. And then this information is obtained. You have a plain text message. It's translated into English, of course. And then people who are deciding what should be done with this, high-level intelligence officers, yes, this should go to Pat should get this. And it was sent to him through that special channel, the Ultra channel, and that man got it in the field and went out to talk to Patton or whoever it was, tell him, this is what we know. We have a message saying the Germans planning to attack here. Do you want to do something? You know, you're the general. You got to do what you want. And told them what the Germans were planning to do, and then leave it up to the general to do that. But that seems to be the way it was done.
Well, I think the conversation talked about how badly Montgomery believed or used. Can you answer why?
I have no idea about that. I don't know anything about that.
You come with a very interesting perspective. You're probably the smartest guy in the room when it comes to cyber intelligence. But you think of the advances in telecommunications and the computer, a satellite, all of the things now that are available to organizations like the NSA. And do the NSA's activities bother you? Are you concerned about that? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
I am bothered by these. I'm an American citizen. I don't want them listening to my messages. Mostly they're just going to get me calling up the liquor store and calling up the babysitter. Nevertheless, they shouldn't be doing that. And without a warrant or suspicion that I'm a criminal or something like that, they shouldn't do this. And it does concern me, and I think the fallout for that is going to be very great and very deleterious to the NSA and maybe possibly along the way to American intelligence. So I'm not happy about this, and I think Many people are not. I don't know how many of the people who are working for NSA feel this way about it. Of course, their paychecks come from NSA, and they're all also American citizens, and they may have been told by the guys, listen, this is important for us, it's for national security, we got to protect about Al-Qaeda and all of that. So this is what you have to do, and you have to keep on doing this. We know better than you. This happens. This happens in many places, and I basically think that's what happens. But when it comes out into the public, as it does now, I think the consequences may be very severe and not so great for the Americans and American national security. But we'll have to wait and see.
In a paper transmission or paper system like the Japanese used, how did they get the information to the field?
Oh, they just handed it by couriers.
Over hundreds of miles?
Yes, they did. Well, they couldn't transmit the key by radio. But the keys were handed by paper from one guy to another. Just as they reported back with strength reports. Those went by paper, and they went back to Tokyo or whatever it is. And in the other direction, supplies went there. And in addition to supplies, the other thing that went there was were code keys and all of that.
I thought I read a long time ago that the Enigma machine was developed by a German private company, and that they actually offered a system or a machine to the American Army, and they turned it down in the 20s, and that they also sold it to the Japanese. And I thought the Japanese were using the Enigma machine or form of it or a philosophy of it, and that the American Army and Navy broke it separately, I think, by themselves without help of the British.
As I understand it, the Enigma was invented by a man named Arthur Scherpius, and he wanted to give it to the public to make money. He was trying to sell a lot of machines. He thought that many companies would use these machines to keep their messages secret in the new era of international communications. It didn't work out. People were not interested. He was, as I said earlier, he was not the only one who did it. People in the United States and people in Sweden attempted to do it as well. Didn't work. But the machine was set up so that if you changed the wiring in the machines, you wouldn't be able to have the messages. Even though you had an Enigma machine and I had an Enigma machine, your wiring would be different, so I couldn't read those messages. So that's basically the way it worked. As for the Army, the American Army, get it, yes, we bought those machines to see what it was like, and we attempted to solve them. We never used it. We had similar guys inventing similar machines, which we developed on our own. The Navy in particular did that with separate wiring, better stepping and turning procedures. And that's how we were better in this field than the Germans. Also, we were 10 years later, so we could work on 10 years' worth of experience, and we were able to do it much better than the Germans.
Okay, George.
They had Russian machines there, and one of the characteristics that they made in describing where they had so many more rotors than the German machines. Was there a significant difference between the Russian and the German machines?
I don't know about the Russian machine, but it's obvious that if you have 7 rotors instead of just 4, you would have greater complexity in the encipherment system and in attempting to break it. But I didn't see those machines when I was in Bletchley Park, and so I'm sorry I'm not able to talk about that with any intelligent way.
Well, listen, thank all of you for coming. Come up, buy a book, come up and visit with David. Thank you for coming to Minnesota, and we didn't need a translator for your New York accent.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming Roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.